There's a moment in episode 18 of the second season, beside the dying fire, that I keep coming back to. Shane's hand is gripping Rick's shoulder tight, desperate, the touch of a man trying to pull his best friend toward a truth Rick doesn't want to see. And Shane says something that echoes through the entire rest of the series. You can't just be the good guy and expect to live, Rick. Not anymore. And then Rick stabs him, kills his best friend to protect his family, to stop the threat Shane's become. But here's what haunts me about that moment. Shane was right. About almost everything. About what the world had become, about what survival required, about the fact that Rick's idealism was going to get people killed. Shane just saw it too early, before anyone, including Rick, was ready to hear it. So, tonight, let's trace something uncomfortable, Shane's warnings through Rick's entire arc. Every brutal choice Rick made that proved Shane right. Every moment Rick became the man he killed Shane for being. Because maybe Shane wasn't the villain. Maybe he was just the messenger no one wanted to believe. And maybe understanding that changes everything we thought we knew about Rick Grimes' journey. Settle in. This one's about being right at the wrong time, and what it costs everyone. Shane Walsh and Rick Grimes start the apocalypse as partners, brothers, best friends, and within months, they're enemies. And the thing is, their conflict isn't really about Lori, though that's part of it. Their conflict is philosophical. It's about what kind of men they're going to be in this new world. And Shane adapts fast, faster than anyone else in the group. Shane sees what the apocalypse is, survival of the most pragmatic, the most willing to make brutal calls, and Shane embraces it. While Rick's still trying to be the sheriff, still trying to maintain pre-outbreak morality, Shane's already operating from pure survival logic. And Shane's methods work. That's the uncomfortable part. In Season 2, Episode 6, Secrets, Shane and Otis are on a supply run to get medical equipment to save Carl, who's been shot. And they're trapped, surrounded by walkers, and there's no way both of them escape. And Shane makes a calculation. He shoots Otis in the leg, leaves him as bait for the walkers, and escapes with the supplies. And Carl survives. Carl lives because Shane sacrificed Otis. And Shane's devastated by what he's done. You see it in John Bernthal's performance, the horror and guilt Shane's carrying. But Shane also knows it was necessary. Knows that if he hadn't done it, Carl would have died, and Shane would have died, and Otis would have died anyway when the walkers overwhelmed them. Shane chose who lived, and he chose Carl. And Rick hates Shane for it. Rick sees Shane's choice as murder, as abandoning morality for convenience. But Rick doesn't have a better answer. Rick doesn't have a way to save Carl without someone dying. Rick just has idealism, the belief that there must be another way, that good people don't sacrifice innocence to save their own. And Shane's looking at Rick like Rick's a child clinging to a fairy tale, because Shane's seen the world for what it is, and Rick hasn't. Not yet. The pattern throughout Season 2 is Shane arguing for brutal pragmatism, and Rick resisting. Shane wants to kill Randall, the kid they rescue who's from a hostile group, because Randall's a security risk. Rick wants to spare him, give him a chance. Shane wants to take over Herschel's farm by force if necessary because the group needs it. Rick wants to negotiate, respect Herschel's ownership. Shane sees threats everywhere and wants to eliminate them preemptively. Rick sees potential allies and wants to extend trust. And the show keeps proving Shane right and Rick wrong. Randall's group does find the farm. Dale dies, arguing for mercy. The farm falls, and Rick's idealism accomplishes nothing except making Shane more frustrated and more certain that Rick's going to get everyone killed. The emotional anchor is that Shane loved Carl and Lori. That's what's driving him. Not ambition, not cruelty. Love. Shane believed Carl was his son. Lori let him believe that during the months she thought Rick was dead, And Shane's brutality, his willingness to kill Otis and argue for killing Randall and take the farm by force, all of it comes from desperate love. Shane's trying to protect his family the only way he knows how, by being harder and faster and more ruthless than the threats. And Rick's trying to protect the same people by being good, by maintaining morality, by proving that humanity can survive the apocalypse. And Shane's watching Rick's method fail over and over, watching people die because Rick hesitated or showed mercy or trusted the wrong person, and Shane's breaking. Because Shane sees the future, sees that Rick's going to have to become brutal eventually, and Shane can't understand why Rick won't just accept it now, before more people die. Here's the question Shane's forcing us to ask. If Shane's methods kept people alive, was he wrong? Because morally, yes, Shane's wrong. You don't shoot an innocent man in the leg and leave him to be eaten alive. That's murder. But pragmatically, Shane's right. Carl lived. The medical supplies got back. And if Shane hadn't made that choice, Carl would be dead, and Shane would be dead, and Otis would be dead, and the group would have fallen apart from grief. So Shane's murder saved 3 lives at the cost of 1. And that's utilitarian calculus. And it worked. And Rick hated Shane for it. But Rick would later make the exact same calculation. Kill 1 to save many. Sacrifice the few to protect the group. Rick would become Shane. He just wasn't ready yet. And Shane couldn't wait for Rick to be ready, because people were dying while Rick figured it out. The Barn, Season 2, Episode 7, Pretty Much Dead Already. This is where Shane's philosophy collides most violently with Rick's, and where Shane proves his point so brutally that Rick can't deny it anymore. Herschel's been keeping walkers in his barn, family members, neighbors, people he knew before they turned, because Herschel believes they're sick, that they can be cured, that there's still people underneath. And Rick's going along with this, not because Rick believes it, but because Rick's trying to respect Herschel's property and beliefs, trying to maintain the social contract that says you don't force your worldview on others. And Shane's done with it. Shane sees those walkers as threats, sees Herschel's delusion as dangerous. And Shane can't understand why Rick's humoring it, why Rick's letting the group stay on a farm with a barn full of walkers just to avoid confronting Herschel. So Shane takes matters into his own hands. Shane opens the barn doors, and the walkers pour out, and Shane and the group shoot them all, massacre them, prove definitively that they're not sick people. They're dead things. They're monsters that will kill you if you give them the chance. And Shane's right. The walkers aren't curable. Herschel's hope is a delusion, and that delusion was endangering everyone. Because what if the barn had broken open at night? What if those walkers had gotten loose while people were sleeping? Shane's violence, his brutal pragmatism, it ended a threat that could have killed the entire group. Shane forced everyone to face reality. Forced them to stop pretending the old world's rules still applied. Forced them to accept that mercy toward walkers is stupidity that gets you killed. But Shane also destroyed hope. That's the cost. Because Herschel wasn't just delusional. Herschel was hoping. Hoping that his wife, his neighbors, the people he loved, they weren't gone forever. Hoping that medicine would find a cure, that the dead could come back as more than monsters. And Shane killed that hope, shot it in the head in front of everyone, proved that the people they loved were gone and weren't coming back. And that's necessary, maybe. That's facing reality. But it's also cruel. It's taking away the one thing that makes survival bearable, the belief that things might get better. And then Sophia stumbles out of the barn. The little girl the group's been searching for, the daughter Carol's been praying for. She's been in Herschel's barn the whole time. Dead. A walker. And Rick's the one who shoots her. Rick kills Sophia because Shane's already proven the point, already shown that walkers aren't people, and now Rick has to follow through, has to accept Shane's reality and act on it. And you see something break in Rick in that moment. Rick's been resisting Shane's worldview, trying to hold on to hope and morality and the belief that being good matters. And Sophia's death, the proof that all their searching was for nothing, that she was dead within days and they just didn't know it, that destroys Rick's hope. Rick sees that Shane's right, that the world is brutal and unforgiving, and hoping for the best just means you're unprepared when the worst happens. The emotional anchor is Shane's frustration. Shane's been trying to protect the group, trying to make them see reality, and they've been resisting him, treating him like he's the problem. And Shane's not wrong to be frustrated. Shane's been right about the walkers, right about the threats, right about what survival requires. But Shane's also been cruel about it, been dismissive of people's grief and hope, been pushing so hard and so fast that people can't keep up, and that's Shane's fatal flaw. Not that he's wrong, that he can't slow down, can't meet people where they are, can't build trust before demanding they abandon everything they believed. The pattern The Walking Dead establishes is that mercy leads to death. Dale argues for mercy toward Randall, dies that same episode. Herschel shows mercy toward walkers, loses his farm. Beth maintains hope and innocence, gets killed at Grady Memorial. Over and over, the show punishes characters who cling to pre-outbreak morality, and it rewards, or at least doesn't punish, characters who adapt to brutality. Shane survives Season 2 until Rick kills him. The governor survives until his own people turn on him. Negan survives everything. The brutal pragmatists live longer than the hopeful idealists. And Shane's been saying this all along. We ain't them. We're not the old world anymore. We can't be. And the barn massacre is Shane proving it in the most visceral way possible. Here's what keeps me up about this scene. Shane killed hope so people could survive. And maybe that was necessary. Maybe hope is a luxury you can't afford when walkers are trying to eat you. Maybe facing reality, no matter how brutal, is the only way to live long enough to matter. But if hope dies, if you give up on the possibility that things can be better, then what are you surviving for? Just to not die? Just to keep breathing? Is that enough? Shane would say yes. Survival is enough. Living one more day is victory. And maybe he's right. But maybe that's also why Shane ends up dead. Because survival without hope, without something to live for beyond just surviving, that's not really living. That's just existing. And Shane couldn't see the difference. Season 2, Episode 18. Beside the dying fire. Rick kills Shane, and everything changes. The moment that knife goes into Shane's chest, Rick stops being the idealistic sheriff trying to preserve morality and becomes something else, something harder. And the transformation completes in the episode's final scene. The group's debating where to go, what to do, and Rick tells them, "This isn't a democracy anymore." Direct quote. Rick's adopting Shane's authoritarian philosophy. Rick's saying, "I'm in charge. You follow my orders. We don't debate or vote or discuss. We survive by doing what I say." And that's Shane's playbook. That's everything Shane argued for, and Rick resisted. And the group's horrified. They're looking at Rick like he's become a stranger. Because he has. Rick's killed his best friend and absorbed his philosophy. Rick's learned that Shane was right about what survival requires: brutal decisiveness, authoritarian control, elimination of threats without hesitation. And Rick's choosing to become that. Choosing to be the leader Shane said the group needed. And the cost is Rick's soul, or at least the part of Rick's soul that believed being good mattered more than being alive. The evidence that Rick becomes Shane is in every choice Rick makes post-Season 2. In Season 3, Rick encounters prisoners in the prison and immediately starts making Shane-style calculations. Tomas, one of the prisoners, is aggressive, challenging, potentially dangerous, and Rick doesn't try to rehabilitate him or give him a chance. Rick kills him. Buries a machete in Tomas's skull the moment Tomas proves he's a threat. No trial, no second chance, just elimination of danger. That's Shane's method. That's what Shane would have done. And Rick does it without hesitation, without remorse. Rick's learned that hesitation gets people killed. And Rick rejects Tyrese's group initially when they arrive at the prison. These are good people, survivors who could help, who could strengthen the community. And Rick turns them away, yells at them, hallucinates Lori's ghost, has a complete breakdown. And part of that is Rick's grief and trauma. But part of it is Rick applying Shane's logic. New people are risks. They might be threats. They might endanger the group. Better to turn them away than risk them betraying you. Rick's become paranoid, seeing threats everywhere, unwilling to extend trust. That's Shane's mindset, and Rick's living it. The emotional anchor is that Rick killed Shane but absorbed his philosophy, and that's the tragedy. Because Rick didn't defeat Shane. Rick became Shane. Rick proved Shane right by turning into the exact leader Shane said Rick needed to be. Authoritarian, brutal, pragmatic, and Rick hates himself for it. You see it in Andrew Lincoln's performance throughout Season 3. Rick's grieving Lori, hallucinating her ghost, having phone conversations with dead people. Rick's breaking under the weight of becoming what he swore he'd never become. And Rick can't stop, because Shane was right. The brutal approach works. Rick's group survives. The prison is secure. Carl's alive. And that success is proof that Shane's philosophy, horrible as it is the only philosophy that works in the apocalypse. The theory is that Shane's death was Rick's transformation. Rick killed the man who showed him the truth, then spent the next 7 years living that truth. And Rick couldn't admit it. Couldn't say Shane was right and I was wrong. So Rick just became Shane silently, adopted Shane's methods while telling himself he was still different, still better, but he wasn't. Rick in Season 3 is what Shane would have been if Shane had lived. Paranoid, brutal, willing to kill anyone who threatens his family. The only difference is Rick has more people who trust him. Rick built relationships in Season 1 that Shane didn't. So when Rick becomes brutal, the group tolerates it because they love Rick. But if Shane had become the leader, had made the same choices Rick's making, the group would have rebelled. Because they didn't love Shane. They feared him. Here's what I can't stop thinking about. Can you reject someone's methods while proving them right? Because that's what Rick does. Rick kills Shane, tells himself Shane was wrong, then spends years becoming Shane in everything but name. And maybe that's the only way Rick could accept Shane's philosophy, by killing Shane first, proving Shane was the villain, then quietly adopting everything Shane believed once Shane wasn't there to say, "I told you so." Because Rick's ego couldn't handle admitting Shane was right. Rick needed to be the hero, the good guy, the moral center, and Shane's existence threatened that. So Shane had to die, and then Rick could become him. And Rick spent Season 2 fighting Shane, and Rick spent Seasons 3 through 9 being Shane, just with better PR. Season 3, Rick is unrecognizable from Season 1 Rick. Season 1 Rick apologized to walkers before killing them. Season 3, Rick buries machetes in people's skulls without a second thought. And every choice Rick makes, every brutal call, it's Shane's playbook. Eliminate threats. Don't give second chances. Rule through strength and fear. Protect your people by being the scariest thing in the apocalypse. That's Shane's philosophy, and Rick's living it. When Rick encounters the prisoners, Rick immediately establishes dominance. Rick tells them the prison belongs to his group now, and the prisoners can stay in a separate cell block, but Rick's in charge. That's authoritarian control. Rick's not offering partnership or democracy. Rick's telling them how it is, and they can accept it or leave. And when Tomas challenges Rick, tries to get Rick killed by pushing walkers at him during a clearing run, Rick retaliates instantly. Rick corners Tomas and kills him. No hesitation. No, let's talk about this. Just violence. Because Tomas proved he was a threat, and threats get eliminated. That's the rule. That's Shane's rule, and Rick's following it. And Rick locks Andrew, another prisoner, in a yard full of walkers and leaves him to die. Andrew wasn't actively threatening Rick in that moment, but Rick decided Andrew was too dangerous to live. So Rick sealed him in with walkers and walked away. That's preemptive execution. That's killing someone not for what they did, but for what they might do. And Shane argued for exactly that with Randall back in Season 2. Shane said you can't risk potential threats. You have to eliminate them before they become actual threats. And Rick rejected that then. Called Shane a murderer for suggesting it. And now Rick's doing it, without even the justification of self-defense. Just cold calculation. This person is too dangerous, so they die. The evidence that Rick's following Shane's playbook is in how similar their leadership styles are. Shane wanted authoritarian control, one leader making decisions without input. Rick establishes exactly that in Season 3. This isn't a democracy becomes Rick's governing principle. Shane wanted to eliminate threats preemptively. Rick kills Tomas and Andrew for being potential threats, not actual ones. Shane prioritized the group's safety over individual lives. Rick makes the same calculation over and over, sacrifice the few to protect the many. Rick's become everything Shane wanted him to be, and the group's safer for it. The prison's secure. Carl's alive. Lori dies in childbirth, not from external threat. The group's surviving because Rick's brutal, because Rick doesn't hesitate, because Rick's willing to make the calls Shane said were necessary. But Rick's also alone. Herschel's wary of Rick. Glenn and Maggie are disturbed by Rick's brutality. Michonne, when she arrives, sees Rick as volatile, dangerous. Rick's effectiveness as a leader, his Shane-style brutality. It's keeping people alive, but also isolating Rick, because people don't love brutal leaders. They follow them out of necessity, out of fear, out of the knowledge that the brutal leader's methods work. But they don't love them, and Rick's feeling that. Rick's hallucinating Lori's ghost, talking to dead people on a phone, having complete breakdowns, and part of that is grief, but part of it is loneliness. Rick's carrying the weight of being Shane, of making the brutal calls, sacrificing the morality he used to believe in, becoming the monster that keeps everyone safe, and it's destroying Rick from the inside. The emotional weight is that Rick hated Shane for being brutal, then became brutal himself, and Rick can't reconcile that, can't admit that Shane was right and Rick was wrong. So Rick's fragmenting, becoming the leader the group needs while hating what he's becoming. And the group sees it. They see Rick's effectiveness and Rick's breakdown simultaneously, and they don't know whether to trust Rick or fear him, because Rick's keeping them alive, yes. But Rick's also becoming something dangerous, something unpredictable, something like Shane. Here's the thing that haunts me. The difference between Rick and Shane is narrowing to just timing. Shane adopted brutality immediately. Week 1 of the apocalypse, Shane's making ruthless calls. Rick resisted for months, tried to hold on to morality, tried to be the good guy, but eventually, Rick arrived at the same place Shane started. Brutal pragmatism, authoritarian control, willingness to kill without hesitation. Rick just took longer to get there, took losing Lori and fighting Shane and watching people die from mercy and idealism. Rick needed to try being good and fail before he could accept being brutal. And maybe that's the key difference. Maybe you can't start brutal like Shane did. Maybe you have to try being good first, fail, then learn brutality through experience. Because if you start brutal, like Shane, people don't trust you. But if you become brutal after proving you're good, like Rick, people follow you. People trust that your brutality comes from necessity, not cruelty. And maybe that's why Rick survived and Shane didn't. Not because Rick was right and Shane was wrong, but because Rick earned trust before becoming brutal. And Shane never had that trust to begin with. By seasons 4 and 5, Rick's transformation is complete. Rick's not pretending to be the good guy anymore. Rick's openly acknowledging that he's become something else, something brutal, something necessary for survival but antithetical to the morality Rick started with. And the show marks this transformation with other characters pointing it out. In Season 4, Episode 16, A, after Rick tears Joe's throat out with his teeth to save Carl from the Claimers, Daryl tells someone Rick's a good man, but Rick isn't acting like a good man. Rick's acting like an animal. And in Season 5, after Rick and the group escape Terminus, the cannibals are hunting them, and Rick's setting traps, planning ambushes. And Bob says something like, "This isn't who we are." And Rick responds, "This is exactly who we are." Rick's not apologizing anymore. Rick's not pretending his brutality is temporary or reluctant. Rick's embraced it. And Joe, the leader of the Claimers, he says something to Rick that sticks with me. After Rick bites Joe's throat and the fight's over, Daryl says Rick's one of the good guys. And Joe, dying, would have disagreed. Joe saw Rick as a threat, as someone pretending to be civilized while being just as savage as anyone else, and Joe's right. Rick's not one of the good guys anymore. Rick's one of the survivors. And survivors, in the Walking Dead's world, can't afford goodness. They can only afford effectiveness. The evidence of Rick's complete transformation is in his violence and his lack of remorse. Rick bites a man's throat out, spits out chunks of flesh, and doesn't apologize, doesn't explain, doesn't justify. Carl's watching, terrified of his own father, and Rick sees Carl's fear, and Rick's devastated, but Rick doesn't regret what he did. Because it worked. Carl survived. Michonne survived. And that's all that matters. The method becoming an animal, becoming something that scares your own child, that's irrelevant as long as the outcome is survival. And Rick's violence at Terminus, the cannibal community that traps the group, it's methodical. Rick's not fighting in self-defense or reacting to threats. Rick's hunting. Rick's tracking the Terminus survivors, setting traps, and when Rick's group corners them in the church, Rick kills them all. Brutally. Methodically. And Father Gabriel, the priest whose church they're using, he's horrified. Gabriel says something like, "This is God's house." And Rick responds that it doesn't matter. These people are threats, and threats get eliminated. And Rick's right, pragmatically. The Terminus survivors were cannibals, were hunters, were going to kill Rick's group if they got the chance. But Rick's method, the cold efficiency of it, the lack of mercy or hesitation, that's Shane. That's pure Shane. Eliminate threats. Don't give second chances. Be more brutal than your enemies so they fear you too much to attack. And Rick admits it. In Season 5, Rick threatens Pete in Alexandria, waves a gun around, tells the Alexandrians that they're weak and naive, and they need Rick's group to survive. And Deanna and the Alexandrians are looking at Rick like he's dangerous, like he's more threat than protector. And Rick doesn't care. Rick's learned that being feared is more effective than being loved. That people follow strength, not morality. And Rick's showing strength. Brutal, terrifying strength. The kind of strength that keeps people alive but also makes them wonder if their protector might kill them if they step out of line. The emotional anchor is that Rick's transformation is complete, the good guy, Shane said. Couldn't survive, is dead, and Rick knows it. Rick's not in denial anymore. Rick's not telling himself he's still the sheriff, still the moral center. Rick's accepted that he's become the brutal pragmatist Shane always was. And Rick's okay with it, or at least resigned to it. Because the alternative being good, being merciful, being the person Rick was in Season 1 that gets people killed. And Rick's lost too many people to mercy. Lost Lori, lost Herschel, almost lost Carl. And Rick's decided that he'd rather be the monster who keeps people alive than the good man who gets them killed. And that's exactly what Shane argued. Shane said, "You can't be the good guy and expect to live." And Rick's proving Shane right by giving up being the good guy, by choosing life over morality, by becoming Shane. The pattern The Walking Dead establishes is that protagonists who survive become morally compromised. Rick becomes brutal. Carol becomes willing to burn people alive to protect the group. Daryl becomes a torturer and enforcer. Maggie becomes harsh and authoritarian. The people who stay good, Dale, Herschel, Beth, Carl, they die. Because goodness is a weakness the apocalypse exploits. And the survivors learn that lesson. Learn that you have to become something you'd have hated before the world ended, or you die. And Rick's learned that lesson fully. Rick's become what he'd have arrested in his sheriff days. And Rick's alive because of it. And everyone Rick loves is alive because of it. And that success, that effectiveness, it justifies everything. It proves Shane was right. Here's the question I can't answer. Did Rick become Shane, or did the world force everyone to become Shane? Because it's not just Rick. It's everyone who survives long term. They all adopt Shane's philosophy eventually. They all become brutal and pragmatic, and willing to kill without hesitation. So was Shane uniquely right? Or was Shane just the first to see what everyone would eventually have to become? And if it's the latter, if Shane's transformation wasn't unique but universal, then Shane wasn't a villain or a prophet. Shane was just ahead of the curve. Shane saw what the apocalypse required and embraced it immediately, while everyone else needed months or years to arrive at the same conclusion. And Shane died before he could see himself vindicated. Died before Rick and Carol and Daryl and everyone else became exactly what Shane said they needed to be. And maybe that's Shane's tragedy. Not that he was wrong. That he was right, but no one believed him until he was gone. Season 6, Episode 12, Not Tomorrow Yet. Rick does something Shane would have absolutely done. Rick preemptively attacks the Saviours. The Hilltop community tells Rick about Negan, about the Saviours extorting communities for resources, and Rick decides to attack first. Not because Negan's threatened Alexandria, not because the Saviours have attacked Rick's people, but because Rick calculates that Negan will eventually become a threat, and it's better to eliminate that threat before it materializes. That's preemptive war. That's Shane's philosophy, taken to its logical extreme. And Rick's group goes to the Saviours' compound at night and kills dozens of people in their sleep. No warning, no negotiation, no attempt at diplomacy, just massacre. Rick's people sneak in and execute sleeping Saviours, and Rick's coldly efficient about it. Rick treats it like a military operation, assignments, tactics, extraction plan, and the group does it. Kills people who haven't directly threatened them, kills people who are sleeping and defenseless, kills people who might be innocents caught up in Negan's organization. And Rick doesn't lose sleep over it. Rick's made the calculation. These people are part of a group that could threaten Alexandria, so they have to die. All of them. That's Shane's logic. Kill threats before they threaten you. Be more brutal than your enemies. Ensure your safety by making everyone else afraid. And it backfires. Negan retaliates. Negan captures Rick's people and kills Glenn and Abraham to teach Rick a lesson. You don't get to kill my people without consequences. And Negan's retaliation is brutal and traumatizing and destroys Rick. Season 7, Rick is broken, subservient, terrified. And Rick's broken because his Shane-style preemptive violence created the situation that got Glenn and Abraham killed. If Rick hadn't attacked the Saviours, Negan wouldn't have known Alexandria existed. wouldn't have retaliated. Glenn and Abraham would be alive, and Rick has to carry that. Has to know that his brutality, his willingness to kill first and ask questions it killed his friends. The evidence that Rick's taking Shane's philosophy to an extreme Shane might not have endorsed is in the scale. Shane wanted to kill Randall, one person, because Randall was a security risk. Rick kills dozens of Saviours, many of whom weren't threats, based on the possibility that Negan's organization might eventually threaten Alexandria. That's escalation. That's taking Shane's preemptive violence from individual threat elimination to mass preemptive war. And Rick justifies it the same way Shane justified killing Randall. Better safe than sorry. Better to kill people who might be threats than risk them becoming actual threats. But the scale's different, and the consequences are worse. Because killing one person, you might get away with. Killing dozens, you create enemies. You start wars. And Rick's attack on the Saviours started a war that killed Glenn, Abraham, and ultimately Carl. The emotional anchor is that Rick's violence gets Glenn and Abraham killed, Shane's methods failing at scale, because Shane's philosophy works for small-scale survival. Kill one person to protect your family. Eliminate individual threats before they manifest. That's sustainable. But Rick's applying that philosophy at community scale. Kill dozens to protect your community. Eliminate entire organizations before they threaten you. And that doesn't work. That creates cycles of violence, escalation, wars that consume everyone. And Rick's learning that Shane's methods, effective as they are for individual survival, don't scale, don't work for communities. Because communities require cooperation, require trust, require something beyond just eliminating threats. And Rick's attack on the Saviours, his Shane-style preemptive violence, it violated the possibility of cooperation. It made Negan an enemy when Negan could have been ignored or negotiated with. And that mistake killed Rick's friends. And here's what I keep thinking about. Shane was right about being brutal. But maybe even Shane wouldn't have gone this far. Because Shane's brutality was personal. Shane killed Otis to save Carl. Shane wanted to kill Randall to protect Lori. Shane's violence was always rooted in protecting specific people he loved. But Rick's attack on the Saviours, that's not personal. Rick doesn't know the Saviours, hasn't been threatened by them directly. Rick's acting from abstract calculation. This group could be dangerous, so eliminate them. That's colder than Shane. That's Shane's philosophy stripped of the love that justified it. And maybe that's where Rick went wrong. Maybe Shane's brutality worked because it was grounded in specific, personal love. And Rick's brutality fails because it's grounded in abstract threat assessment. Because when you kill for love, people understand. They might not agree, but they understand. But when you kill from calculation, from cold strategic logic, you become the villain. And that's what Rick became to Negan. Not a grieving father protecting his family. A warlord eliminating competition. And Negan responded accordingly. Seasons 7 and 8 are where Shane's philosophy fails spectacularly. Negan breaks Rick, utterly. Rick watches Glenn and Abraham die, watches Negan beat them to death with a baseball bat, and Rick's powerless to stop it. And Negan keeps Rick subjugated for months. Takes Alexandria's resources, threatens to kill more people if Rick resists, humiliates Rick repeatedly. And Rick, the brutal pragmatist who adopted Shane's philosophy, Rick can't do anything. Because Rick's brutality created an enemy he can't defeat, and Rick's paying the price. And then the war. Season 8 is Rick fighting Negan, trying to defeat the Saviours, trying to win through violence and brutality. And it works. Kind of. Rick's coalition, Alexandria, Hilltop, the Kingdom, they eventually defeat the Saviours. But the cost is staggering. The Kingdom falls. The Hilltop's damaged. Alexandria's barely surviving. And Carl dies. Carl gets bitten during the war while helping Sadiq, a stranger Carl's trying to bring into the community. and Carl dies asking Rick to make peace. Carl dies asking Rick to stop the violence, to honor humanity over vengeance, to be better than brutal. And that's the judgment. That's The Walking Dead's narrative judgment on Rick's adoption of Shane's philosophy. Because Carl's death isn't random. Carl dies helping someone, doing exactly what Rick used to do in Season 1, being the good person Rick stopped being, and Carl dies asking Rick to go back to being that person, to reject Shane's brutality and embrace mercy. And Carl's dying wish is a repudiation of everything Rick's become, everything Shane argued for. Carl saying, the brutality, the preemptive violence, the willingness to kill without hesitation, it doesn't work. It just creates more violence. And Carl's asking Rick to break the cycle, to prove that Shane was wrong, that you can be good and survive, that humanity matters more than effectiveness. The evidence that Shane's philosophy works short-term but creates long-term problems is in the consequences. Shane's brutality kept Carl alive in Season 2, but Rick's adoption of Shane's brutality created the war with Negan that got Carl killed in Season 8. Shane's method saved Carl once and killed Carl eventually. And that pattern, short-term effectiveness, long-term catastrophe, that's what the show's demonstrating. Shane's right that brutality keeps you alive today, but brutality creates enemies who kill you tomorrow, and Rick's living that pattern. Rick survived Seasons 3 through 7 by being brutal, and Rick lost Carl because his brutality created wars that consumed everyone. The emotional weight is massive. Carl's not just another death. Carl's Rick's son, Rick's reason for surviving, the person Rick became brutal to protect. And Carl dies because of Rick's brutality, dies in a war Rick started, dies asking Rick to be better, to stop being Shane, and Rick's devastated. Rick's entire justification for becoming brutal protecting Carl, it's gone. Carl's dead, and Carl's last wish is that Rick reject the brutality, reject Shane's philosophy, prove that goodness can survive. And Rick has to decide, keep being Shane and win the war, or honor Carl and choose mercy. And here's the thing Shane would have gotten wrong. Shane's philosophy kept Rick alive, but cost Rick his son. Shane would have said, that's acceptable, that survival matters more than anything else, that you make the brutal calls and carry the weight and survive anyway. But Carl's death proves that survival isn't enough, that living without the people you're trying to protect is failure, not success. Shane kept Carl alive by killing Otis. Rick got Carl killed by being like Shane. And the lesson is that Shane's philosophy has a limit, works for immediate threats, but fails for long-term survival. Because brutality creates cycles, creates enemies, creates wars that consume everything. And you can win every battle and still lose what matters. And that's what happened to Rick. Rick won the war with Negan, defeated the Saviours, and lost Carl anyway. Because the war itself, the violence and danger and chaos of it, that's what got Carl killed. And the war happened because Rick adopted Shane's preemptive violence philosophy. And Shane's philosophy killed the person it was supposed to protect. Carl's letters. Season 8, Carl writes letters to everyone before he dies. To Rick, to Michonne, to Negan. And Carl's letters are asking people to make peace, to stop the violence, to honor humanity over vengeance. Carl's dying wish is the opposite of Shane's philosophy. Carl's asking people to be good even when it's harder, even when it costs more, even when being brutal would be more effective. Carl's rejecting everything Shane represented, everything Rick became. And Carl's asking Rick to go back, to remember who Rick was in Season 1, to be the good man who apologized to walkers, who tried to save everyone, who believed morality mattered even in the apocalypse, and Rick tries. Season 8's finale. Rick has Negan beaten, has a knife to Negan's throat, can kill the man who killed Glenn and Abraham and terrorized Rick's people for over a year. And Rick stops. Rick slits Negan's throat but doesn't kill him, saves him, imprisons him instead, chooses mercy over vengeance. And Rick does it because Carl asked him to. Because Carl's last wish was that Rick prove you can survive without being brutal, that you can win without becoming the monster. And Rick honors that. Rick chooses Carl's philosophy over Shane's, and it costs Rick everything. Maggie's furious. Maggie wanted Negan dead for killing Glenn, and Rick denied her that. Daryl's conflicted, doesn't understand why Rick spared the man who killed their friends. The communities are divided. Some support Rick's mercy, others see it as weakness, and Rick's alienated from people he fought with, fought for, because Rick's choosing Carl's vision over their need for justice. And Rick's okay with that, because honoring Carl matters more than being loved, more than being right, more than anything. The emotional anchor is Rick's choice between Shane's way, survive by any means, and Carl's way, survive with humanity. And Rick chooses Carl. Rick rejects Shane's philosophy after 7 years of living it. Rick decides that survival without humanity, without mercy, without the possibility of being good, that's not survival worth having. That, Carl's right. You have to be more than just alive. You have to be human. And Rick's choosing humanity even though it's harder, even though it costs more, even though it makes Rick vulnerable, because Carl asked him to. And Carl's death only has meaning if Rick changes because of it. The pattern The Walking Dead establishes is that Shane's brutality leads to survival without meaning. Characters who adopt Shane's philosophy survive, but they survive hollow, isolated, carrying weight that crushes them. Rick survives seasons 3 to 7 but loses Lori, loses Herschel, loses Glenn and Abraham, almost loses Carl. Carol survives but has multiple breakdowns from the weight of what she's done. Daryl survives but becomes isolated, unable to connect. The brutality works for survival but destroys everything that makes survival worthwhile. And Carl's letters are asking, what's the point of surviving if you hate what you've become? If everyone you loved is dead or afraid of you? If you can't look in a mirror without seeing a monster? And here's the question that breaks my heart. If Shane's methods kept Rick alive but cost Carl, were they worth it? Because that's the calculation. Rick adopted Shane's philosophy and survived 7 years. And Carl died, asking Rick to reject that philosophy. So did Shane save Rick's life so Carl could tell Rick he was wrong? Did Shane's brutality keep Rick alive long enough to learn that brutality fails? And if so, was Shane right or wrong? Because Shane's methods worked, Rick survived. But Shane's methods also failed, Carl died. And both are true simultaneously. And Rick has to live with both. Has to live with the knowledge that Shane was right about survival and wrong about life. Right that brutality keeps you breathing, and wrong that breathing is enough. Season 9, Episode 5. Rick's final episode before he disappears for years. Rick chooses sacrifice over survival. Rick's injured, impaled on rebar, barely able to move. And there's a walker horde heading toward the communities, toward the bridge where people are working, where everyone Rick loves is vulnerable, and Rick could leave, could save himself. But Rick chooses to blow the bridge. Rick detonates the explosives, destroys the horde, nearly kills himself in the process, and Rick's okay with that, because saving everyone else matters more than surviving. That's the opposite of Shane's philosophy. Shane's philosophy is survival first, always. Protect yourself and the people you love by any means necessary. And Rick's philosophy, post-Carl, is sacrifice. Protect everyone, even if it costs you everything, even if it costs your life. And Rick's thinking about Carl when he makes that choice. about Carl's letters asking for peace and community and hope. And Rick's honoring that by saving the communities, preserving the peace, protecting the future Carl wanted. Rick's choosing Carl's vision over Shane's, and it nearly kills him. The CRM saves Rick, takes him, and Rick spends years trying to get back. But in that moment on the bridge, Rick thought he was dying, and Rick was okay with it. Because he'd done something purely good, something without calculation, something that honored Carl's memory. The theory is that Rick finally rejects Shane's philosophy, chooses mercy and sacrifice over brutality and survival. And it's taken Rick 8 years to get there. 8 years of living Shane's way, becoming brutal and ruthless and effective. 8 years of surviving by being the monster. And Carl's death breaks that pattern, shows Rick that Shane's way doesn't lead where Rick needs to go, doesn't create the world Carl deserved to live in. And Rick changes. Rick becomes good again, not naive like Season 1 Rick, but intentionally good, choosing goodness despite knowing the cost. Despite knowing it makes him vulnerable, because Carl asked him to, and Rick would rather die honoring Carl than survive betraying him. The evidence that Rick's sacrifice is the opposite of Shane's survival-first approach is in the choice. Shane kills Otis to survive. Rick nearly dies to save everyone. Shane prioritizes his own life and the lives of people he loves. Rick prioritizes the community, people he barely knows, strangers who matter because they're human and they deserve to be saved. Shane's philosophy is narrow, protect your family. Everyone else is expendable. Rick's philosophy, post-Carl, is broad. Protect everyone you can, even if it costs you your family. And that's transcendence. That's Rick moving beyond Shane, beyond the brutal pragmatist who only cares about immediate survival. Rick's becomes someone who cares about meaning, about building something beyond just staying alive, about creating a world worth living in, not just surviving in. The emotional weight is that Rick becomes good again by rejecting everything Shane taught him. And it takes losing Carl, takes Carl dying, asking Rick to be better. Takes Rick carrying Carl's letters and reading them and trying to become the man Carl believed Rick could be. And Rick does it. Rick spares Negan. Rick unites the communities. Rick sacrifices himself on the bridge. Rick becomes the good man Shane said couldn't survive. And Rick doesn't survive, not in the way Shane meant. Rick disappears, taken by the CRM, separated from everyone he loves. But Rick also succeeds. The communities survive. Peace holds. Rick's sacrifice matters. And that's victory, even if Rick's not there to see it. Because Rick proved that goodness can work, that you don't have to be brutal to survive, that Carl's vision was possible. And it took Rick 7 years and losing everything to realize Shane was wrong. But Rick realized it. And that's redemption, if Rick needs redeeming. Here's what I keep thinking. It took Rick 7 years and losing Carl to realize Shane was wrong. And that's almost unbearably sad, because Shane was wrong. Shane's philosophy, be brutal, survive at any cost, protect your family by being the scariest thing in the apocalypse. It kept Rick alive but destroyed everything Rick cared about. Destroyed Rick's relationships, destroyed Rick's sense of self, ultimately contributed to Carl's death. And Rick only realized Shane was wrong after it was too late to matter. After Carl was gone, after the damage was done. And Rick can't go back, can't undo the years of brutality, can't bring Carl back. All Rick can do is change going forward, honor Carl by being better. And Rick does that, but it doesn't erase the past, doesn't make Shane's philosophy retroactively wrong or right, just makes it insufficient. Shane was right that brutality keeps you alive, and wrong that being alive is enough. And Rick learned that lesson the hardest way possible. So here's the judgment, the central question we've been building toward. Was Shane right about survival, wrong about life? Because that's what the evidence suggests. Shane understood what survival requires. Be brutal, eliminate threats, prioritize your safety over others, be willing to do anything to keep breathing. And Shane was correct. Those methods work. Rick survived by using them. Carol survived. Daryl, Maggie, everyone who made it long-term adopted Shane's philosophy, at least partially. The brutal pragmatists survived. The hopeful idealists died. That pattern's consistent across 11 seasons. But Shane didn't understand why survival matters. Shane thought staying alive was the goal, full stop. But the show keeps asking, alive for what? To do what? To become what? And Shane didn't have answers. Shane's goal was survival. And once you're surviving, Shane's philosophy says just keep surviving. Forever. Brutal and isolated and carrying weight but alive. And the show's suggesting that's not enough. That survival without meaning is just prolonged dying. That you have to be more than just alive. You have to be human. And Shane's philosophy doesn't leave room for humanity. Leaves room for effectiveness, for pragmatism, for brutal survival. But not for mercy, hope, community, love. And those things, the show argues, those are what make survival worthwhile. Carl's philosophy, the one he writes in his letters, it's the opposite. Carl's philosophy says, be good even when it's hard. Help people even when it's dangerous. Choose hope over fear. Build community over fortresses. And Carl's philosophy gets Carl killed. Carl dies helping Sadiq, dies being the good person Rick stopped being. And Shane would say that proves Carl was wrong. That goodness is suicide in the apocalypse. But Carl's death also inspires Rick to change, inspires the communities to unite, inspires peace that lasts years. Carl's goodness, Carl's sacrifice, it creates meaning, creates a future worth surviving for. And that's what Shane's philosophy can't do. Shane's brutality creates survival, but not meaning. Carl's goodness creates meaning, even though it costs Carl his survival. And Rick's journey is learning to balance both. Learning that Shane was right about some things you have to be willing to fight, to protect, to make brutal calls sometimes. But Shane was wrong that brutality is enough, that survival is the goal. Rick learns that you have to couple Shane's pragmatism with Carl's humanity. Have to be brutal when necessary, but good when possible. Have to survive, but also live. Have to protect people so they can build something worth protecting. And that balance, that synthesis of Shane's survival and Carl's meaning, that's what Rick achieves in Season 9. Rick's brutal enough to defeat the Saviours, good enough to spare Negan. Rick's pragmatic enough to survive 8 years, idealistic enough to sacrifice himself for strangers. Rick's Shane and Carl both, and that's the only way to actually make it. Not just survive, but thrive, build, hope. The emotional anchor is that Shane would have survived but never found peace Rick found through sacrifice. Because Shane's philosophy leads to survival without rest. You're always fighting, always watching for threats, always carrying weight. You survive, but you're never at peace, never happy, never content. You're just alive and tired. And Rick, by embracing Carl's philosophy, by choosing sacrifice and mercy, Rick finds peace. Maybe not physical peace Rick's taken by the CRM, spends years fighting to get back, but internal peace. Rick knows he did the right thing, knows he honored Carl, knows he became the man he wanted to be. And that peace, that sense of having lived well, not just survived long, that's what Shane's philosophy can't provide. And that's why Shane's wrong. Not about survival, about life. Here's the question that's haunted this entire exploration. Is living as a monster better than dying human? Because that's the choice Shane's philosophy presents. Become brutal. Give up goodness. Survive as something you'd have hated before the apocalypse. Or stay good. Stay human. Die. Shane chose the former. Carl chose the latter. And Rick tries to find a third option. Rick becomes brutal enough to survive, then reclaims his humanity before he dies, becomes the monster for 7 years, becomes human again in the 8th. And Rick's path suggests you need both. Need Shane's brutality to survive the immediate threats. Need Carl's humanity to make survival meaningful. And if you can balance both, be brutal when necessary, good when possible, then maybe you can survive and live. Not just breathe. Actually live. And that's what Shane couldn't see. That survival is just the foundation. Life is what you build on it. And Shane was so focused on the foundation, he forgot to build anything. Shane's philosophy didn't die with Shane. It became the blueprint for every major villain in The Walking Dead. The governor, Negan, the CRM leadership, they all embody Shane's approach. Eliminate threats preemptively. Rule through fear. Prioritize survival over morality. Treat people as resources or obstacles. That's Shane's playbook, and every antagonist follows it. And every antagonist fails or becomes tyrannical, and that's the pattern. Shane's philosophy works for individual survival but fails for community building. Because communities require trust, cooperation, shared values. And Shane's philosophy undermines all of that. The governor builds Woodbury using Shane's methods. The governor eliminates external threats, rules through charisma and fear, maintains order through violence, and it works until it doesn't. Until the governor's brutality becomes cruelty, his pragmatism becomes paranoia, and Woodbury burns. Negan builds the Saviours the same way. Extorts communities, kills people to make examples, rules through terror, and it works until Rick's coalition defeats him. And even after defeat, after imprisonment, Negan's learned that Shane's philosophy creates enemies faster than it creates safety. That you can't build anything lasting on fear. And the CRM, the Civic Republic military, they're the ultimate expression of Shane's philosophy. Utilitarian calculus taken to the extreme. Kill thousands to save millions. Eliminate communities that might become threats. Control information and resources through military force. And the CRM survives, thrives even, has 50,000 people, advanced technology, functioning civilization, but the CRM's also tyrannical, authoritarian, commits genocides to maintain power. The CRM proves Shane's philosophy works at scale, but only if you're willing to become exactly the kind of evil Shane's methods were supposed to protect against. And that's the catch. Shane's brutality keeps you alive but makes you the villain. And villains don't build communities people want to live in. Villains build prisons. The theory is that Shane's philosophy didn't die, it became the blueprint for tyranny. Because Shane was right that survival requires hard calls, requires prioritizing some lives over others, requires violence. But Shane's philosophy, untempered by mercy or love or hope, it leads inevitably to authoritarianism, leads to leaders who decide who lives and who dies based on what serves the leader's interests, leads to communities built on fear rather than cooperation. And those communities survive, but they're hollow. They're order without joy, survival without meaning, life without humanity. And the show keeps demonstrating this. Every community built on Shane's principles fails or corrupts, and every villain who uses Shane's methods becomes something Rick has to defeat. The evidence is in how similarly the villains talk and act. The governor says things like, "In this life, now, you kill or you die." That's Shane's philosophy exactly. Negan says, "People are a resource." That's Shane's utilitarian calculus. The CRM's leadership talks about acceptable losses and greater good. That's Shane's logic scaled up. And all of them, all the villains, they believe they're doing what's necessary. believe they're protecting their people, believe brutality is justified by survival. They all think they're Shane, think they're the pragmatists making hard calls in impossible circumstances. And they're not entirely wrong. They are making hard calls. They are protecting people, but they're also becoming monsters. And the line between pragmatist and monster, the show suggests, that's thinner than Shane thought. Here's what keeps me up. Shane's way works for survival, but creates tyranny, not community. And that's the fundamental problem with Shane's philosophy. Shane was thinking about individual or family survival. How do I keep Carl alive? How do I protect Lori? And Shane's methods work for that. But when you scale Shane's methods to community level, when you try to build civilization on brutality and fear, you create tyranny. You create the governor, Negan, the CRM. You create places people survive in but don't want to live in. And Rick's journey is learning to see that distinction, learning that keeping people alive isn't enough if you're making them miserable. That survival has to be coupled with meaning, with joy, with hope. And Shane never learned that. Shane died thinking survival was the goal, and his philosophy outlived him, became the foundation for every tyranny Rick fought against. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that Shane was wrong. That Shane was right about survival, and everyone who followed his logic without balancing it with humanity became exactly what Shane would have become if he'd lived long enough. A tyrant keeping people alive against their will and calling it protection. But then there's Daryl, Carol, and Maggie, the protagonists who survived long term, and they all use violence, all make brutal calls, all adopted pieces of Shane's philosophy. But they didn't become villains. They didn't become the governor or Negan. And the question is, why not? What's the difference between learning from Shane and becoming Shane? And I think the answer is connection. Daryl, Carol, Maggie, they're brutal, yes. They kill without hesitation when necessary. But they maintain bonds Shane never could. They love people, trust people, build communities with people rather than ruling over them. And that connection, that love, it tempers the brutality, makes it a tool rather than an identity. Daryl's a perfect example. Daryl's brutal when he needs to be. Daryl tortures people for information, kills without hesitation, uses violence as first resort sometimes. That's Shane's approach. But Daryl's also loyal. Daryl bonds with Rick, with Carol, with Judith. Daryl chooses family over survival multiple times. When Daryl has to choose between safety and rescuing someone he loves, Daryl chooses rescue. That's the opposite of Shane. Shane would choose safety. Shane did choose safety when he killed Otis. But Daryl chooses people. And that choice, that prioritization of bonds over survival, it keeps Daryl human. Keeps Daryl from becoming the monster Shane became. Carol's the same. Carol burns people alive to protect the group. Carol kills without remorse when she decides someone's a threat. Carol's utilitarian calculus is as cold as Shane's kill the few to save the many. But Carol also makes cookies for kids. Carol sits with people who are grieving. Carol builds community while also defending it brutally. And Carol has breakdowns from the weight. Carol exiles herself multiple times because she can't handle what she's become. That guilt, that self-awareness, that's what Shane lacked. Shane justified his brutality, thought it was purely necessary. Carol knows her brutality is both necessary and corrosive, and that knowledge keeps Carol connected to her humanity, even while she's doing inhuman things. Maggie's perhaps the closest to Shane. Maggie's harsh, authoritarian, willing to make brutal calls. Maggie wants to kill Negan and doesn't forgive Rick for sparing him. Maggie leads Hilltop and later communities with an iron fist. But Maggie's building. Maggie's creating systems, farms, trade networks. Maggie's using brutality to protect something. not just to survive. And that purpose, that vision of a future beyond just not dying, that's what separates Maggie from the villains who use Shane's methods. Maggie's Shane's brutality in service of Carl's vision. And that combination works. The theory is that they learned from Shane, but avoided his fatal flaw, isolation. Shane's problem wasn't just brutality. Shane's problem was that he couldn't maintain connections while being brutal. Shane alienated Rick, Lori, the group. Shane's brutality made him lonely. Made him the outsider everyone feared and no one loved. And that isolation made Shane more brutal, more paranoid, more willing to betray people because he didn't feel connected to them anymore. It was a spiral. Brutality leading to isolation, leading to more brutality, until Rick had to kill Shane to stop it. But Daryl, Carol, Maggie, they maintain connections despite brutality. They're brutal to protect people they love, and those people know it, accept it, love them back. And that acceptance, that continued connection, it prevents the spiral, prevents the isolation that turns pragmatism into tyranny. And maybe that's the lesson. Maybe Shane's philosophy works if tempered with love. If you're brutal to protect specific people you care about, and those people know it and reciprocate, then brutality doesn't consume you. But if you're brutal in the abstract, to protect concepts like the group or civilization, without specific human connections grounding you, then brutality makes you the villain. And Shane was the latter. Shane's love for Lori and Carl, it wasn't reciprocated. Lori chose Rick. Carl feared Shane. And Shane's brutality, without that grounding love being returned, it made Shane the threat. Here's what I can't stop thinking about. Can you use Shane's methods without becoming Shane? And the answer the show gives is yes, but only if you maintain bonds Shane couldn't. Only if you're brutal for people, not for abstractions. Only if your brutality is grounded in specific love, and that love is returned, and you let that love limit your brutality. Because Daryl won't kill someone Carol loves. Carol won't burn someone Daryl's protecting. Maggie won't sacrifice people her community needs. Their brutality has limits, boundaries drawn by the people they love. And Shane's brutality didn't have limits. Shane would have killed anyone, sacrificed anyone, if he thought it protected Lori and Carl. And that limitless brutality, that's what makes you the villain. And that's what Daryl, Carol, and Maggie avoid, by loving people who love them back and letting that love constrain how brutal they're willing to be. So here we are, the final question. Was Shane right just too early? And I think the answer is yes and no. Shane was right about what the apocalypse requires. You can't survive being purely good, purely merciful, purely idealistic. You have to adapt, have to become harder, more willing to make brutal calls, more pragmatic about threat elimination. Every long-term survivor learns that. Rick learns it, Carol learns it, Daryl, Maggie, Michonne, everyone who survives adopts pieces of Shane's philosophy. So Shane was right that pre-outbreak morality doesn't work. Right that you have to change to survive. Right that Rick specifically would have to become more like Shane or die. But Shane was wrong about timing, and that's crucial, because you can't start brutal. You can't begin the apocalypse with Shane's philosophy and expect people to follow you. You have to earn trust first. Have to prove you're good, you care about people, you're trying to save everyone before you start making brutal calls that sacrifice some to save others. And Shane skipped that step. Shane adapted immediately. Week 1, Shane's killing Otis. Month 2, Shane's arguing for killing Randall. Shane never gave the group time to trust him before he started being brutal, and that's why Shane failed. The group didn't trust Shane's brutality was necessary. They thought Shane was just cruel, just power-hungry, just willing to kill anyone who inconvenienced him. because they didn't have the foundation of trust that would have let them believe Shane's brutality came from care. Rick had that foundation. Rick spent season 1 proving he was good, he'd sacrifice for the group, he'd try to save everyone. And when Rick became brutal in season 3, the group accepted it because they trusted Rick. Trusted that Rick's brutality was reluctant, necessary, a last resort. And that trust let Rick survive where Shane didn't. Let Rick become brutal without being killed for it. And maybe that's the key lesson. Maybe Shane's philosophy works, but only if you've earned the trust to implement it. Only if people believe your brutality comes from love, not cruelty. And you can't earn that trust if you start brutal. You have to be good first. Fail at being good. Learn through experience that brutality is necessary. And then, once you have trust, once people love you, then you can become brutal and people will follow. The evidence is in the pattern. Leaders who start brutal, the governor, Negan, they fail. Leaders who become brutal after earning trust, Rick, Carol, they survive. And Shane was brutal from the start. Never gave people a chance to love him before he started making them afraid of him. And that's the timing issue. Shane saw the future accurately, saw that everyone would have to become brutal. But Shane tried to drag people to that future before they were ready, and people resisted. And Shane died before he could see himself vindicated, before Rick and Carol and everyone else became exactly what Shane said they'd have to become. The emotional anchor is that Shane's tragedy wasn't being wrong, it was being right before anyone could accept it. Shane saw the truth about the apocalypse months or years before everyone else. And Shane couldn't wait, couldn't slow down, couldn't meet people where they were and gently guide them toward brutality. Shane just demanded they accept it immediately. And people can't do that. People need time to mourn their old morality, to fail at being good, to learn through experience that the world has changed. And Shane didn't give them that time. Shane was the prophet screaming truths no one was ready to hear. And prophets who do that, they get killed. Not for being wrong, for being right too early. And that's Shane. Right about everything. Dead anyway. Here's the question that's going to stay with me. If Shane had waited, had built trust before brutality, would he have succeeded? If Shane had spent season 1 being Rick, trying to save everyone, maintaining morality, proving he cared, and then became brutal in season 2 after earning trust, would the group have followed him? Would Shane be the leader Rick became? And I think, yes. I think Shane had the right philosophy, just the wrong approach. Shane needed to hide his brutality longer. Needed to perform goodness until people loved him. Then reveal the brutality as reluctant necessity. And Shane couldn't do that. Shane was too honest, too impatient, too convinced that people would see reason if he just explained it clearly enough. And people don't work that way. People need to feel trust before they accept brutality. And Shane never understood that, and it killed him. And his philosophy lived on, became the foundation everyone else survived on. And Shane's not there to see it. Died before anyone could admit he was right. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that Shane was wrong. That Shane was right, and no one believed him until he was gone. And by then it was too late for Shane. But not for Rick. Not for the others. They learned from Shane's truth even though they killed him for speaking it. And they survived because of lessons Shane taught them. And Shane's grave is unmarked, forgotten, and Rick's a legend. And maybe that's fair. Maybe the prophet who sees the future doesn't get to live in it. Maybe seeing clearly costs too much, and Shane paid that cost, saw what everyone would become, died trying to make them become it faster, and succeeded posthumously after it was too late to matter, to him, but not to everyone else. Thanks for staying with me on this one. If Shane's story got you thinking about being right at the wrong time, or what it costs to see the truth before anyone else is ready to hear it, I'd really appreciate a like. It helps these late-night theory explorations find other people who can't stop thinking about these impossible questions. And drop your location in the comments. I'm curious where you're watching from. There's something comforting about knowing we're all in different parts of the world, different times of night, but lying here in the dark wondering the same thing. Would we be Shane or Rick? Would we adapt too fast and die alone? Or adapt too slow and get everyone killed? Sleep well. And remember, Shane wasn't the villain. He just saw what Rick would have to become 7 years before Rick was ready to accept it, and he died for being right too early. Maybe that's the real tragedy of The Walking Dead. Not that Shane was wrong, that Shane was right, and it didn't matter. Because timing is everything, and being right at the wrong time gets you killed just as surely as being wrong. Sweet dreams. And maybe, just maybe, think about the truths you're not ready to hear yet, the ones someone's trying to tell you, before it's too late to listen.